Hi guys, welcome to our third episode of the Time Maker podcast. Today, Mike and myself have a special guest, a bit different from the two precedent episodes, as he's not a watch brand owner, but he's part of the other category of the watch community, who is essential to the industry. He's actually the guy who's going to back your project or purchase your product, which are indeed the watch enthusiasts. I'm very thrilled to get him today in the podcast because he's a special kind of enthusiast. He's the genuine watch lover, able to show appreciation of different price range within the watch offer. Welcome, Mike. It's a real pleasure to finally meet you, as you also been a brand supporter of us and a loyal customer. So I need to thank you on many different levels for that. So it's really great to have you today with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. And I really love what you guys are doing with the podcast, both from the perspective of aspiring brand owners or entrepreneurs who want to get into the industry. I think that, having Nathan and Peter on the last couple episodes, that's an opportunity to answer a lot of questions that folks might have. They're thinking about getting into it. And then, of course, also from the enthusiast side, the ability to personify or humanize the brands. I mean, one great thing about the micro brands is that there's generally one or two people behind them. And so you really have an opportunity to get to know those people and understand what brought them into the industry or what, compelled them to take an idea and make that into a product.
We're trying our best.
That's great. So again, as Alex said, we're super excited, obviously, to be bringing the third episode of the podcast to everybody. Really excited to bring Mike on as our first enthusiast guest. The most important component of the watch industry, obviously, is the enthusiast and the customers, especially to us micro brands. And I've been fortunate enough, Mike and I chat on a very regular basis, and it's great to be able to bring him on and kind of see how he got into it and what makes an enthusiast tick from his side of things. So I guess first things first, why don't you tell everybody, since it is kind of a global community, whereabouts in the world do you reside, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. I live in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C.
Definitely an interesting part of the country when it comes to history and stuff like that. And I think from a horological standpoint too, there's been some interesting ties over there.
Okay, Mike, our first question for you is what gets you into the watch journey? What gets you started your watch journey as an enthusiast?
Yeah, well, I think, to start off, I had a manual wound Hamilton, kind of something similar to the LL Bean or Field Watch derived commercial versions of the watches that Hamilton had for years in the 70s and 80s. And I had that and got to appreciate winding up every morning. And, that's something about a mechanical movement really gives you a connection to the watch. And I really love that watch. Then, moving into the 80s, I had Timex Ironman, several generations of them, one without Indiglo, one with Indiglo. And I, not that there was anything wrong with that. That was, from a technological standpoint, that was certainly not a nice watch, but an advanced watch for the time period. Then, getting into, my late 10s, early teens, got very into cars, and that actually kind of wrapped it back around. As I start to get an appreciation for cars and engines and motors and even tuning them to some extent, that really brought me back to mechanical watches and an appreciation for watches. And you can only accumulate and keep so many cars, but fortunately, watches are a little bit smaller, so I was able to dive into that a little bit more and really start building a little bit of a collection and appreciating different types of watches.
Awesome. And that's something that I've definitely been impressed with, when you and I chat and do kind of a wrist check every once in a while and stuff too. It's just like Alex said too. And, there's all sorts of different individuals in the watch hobby, but you know, there's certain ones that literally just have an appreciation,
The
regardless of
snobs, Mike. The snobs. That's
Yeah.
the word you're looking for. The watch snobbery. And this is what we want to move away from. And this is why it's so great to have Mike with us today.
Yeah, but I mean, like, you know, when you talk about being genuine as a brand, genuine as a person, it's like, you know, a genuine love for watches and a genuine love for horology is kind of that, like, you know, where it all started, where that first connection with the watch was, and when it started to morph into a collection. And then the fact that, you know, you can keep and appreciate watches that are, you know, low three-figure watches to watches that are high, you know, low five-figure watches too. It's just, it's cool. And I mean, you know, it's the exact opposite of being a watch snob. It's just literally appreciating a hobby. And like you said, and I've never really thought of that too, you know, when it comes to something that's collectible and relatively attainable, but like, you know, compact and easy to store. I've never really thought of that from a collections perspective. So I guess my next question for you, or our next question for you, since we're talking about a collection, I don't know what the threshold is to call something a collection. I think, you know, 2 would be a pair. Anything more than 2, let's call that.
What's the current state, Mike? We want to know.
Yeah. So what would your best guess be for total number of pieces in your collection right now?
Yeah, well, and I think that's fair too, Mike, right? I mean, everybody always talks about the one watch, and let's be honest, most folks have 0 to 1 watches, right? I mean, you can't make other than a love for horology and everything that goes into a watch, you can't really make an argument for having a ton of watches. But you know, people talk about the 1 watch collection or the 3 watch collection. My current collection is maybe almost unwieldy. It's certainly probably still over 100 watches. Somewhere in 3 digits, but obviously lower, close to 100. But that's a lot of watches. That's anywhere from what we might consider a fashion watch, you know, a Timex, to you know, any number of micro brands, and micros being, you know, in the range of a couple $100 to $1,000, maybe $1,500, to, you know, boutique watches. I guess you might consider something like RGM to be boutique as opposed to micro, into, you know, obviously major brands, and that could be anything from, you know, once again, a few $100s to you know, thousands of dollars. Not quite up to anything insane like a Patek or you know, or a JLC or Vacheron yet, but we'll see if that ever happens. I think I'd have a very hard time, especially these days, chewing off or swallowing, putting down that much money, you know, into a wristwatch. That would be insane. Luckily, a fair amount of the collection was when I was younger and had less responsibility and had you know, less to worry about. Not anywhere near retirement, but you know, even in the collection, there's like kind of sub collections. I think, you know, Mike and I have talked about this before. I have a number of Rescos, a fair number of Tudors, there, also Sal Baltimore from a micro perspective. So there's little micro collections within the collection as well.
Yeah, it's very cool. And now let's pretend that your wife's not going to watch this. How many watches do you really have in the collection? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, Instagram's a decent indicator of how many watches there are. I mean,
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
I've sold some, but and there's some that, you know, Instagram didn't exist, and so there aren't pictures. They were flipped before we got to that. But I think that, you know, as you know, Mike, I want to reduce the collection quite a bit. I think there is a point where it gets to, and Alex, as you were referring to, the other type of collector, if you will, who may not be as concerned about horology, you might pick some pieces up, put them in a safe deposit box somewhere, and they'll sit there until they, hopefully for them, appreciate value. But at some point, you know, is 1 a collection, is 3 a collection? Well, somewhere between that and what I have, it's hard to appreciate them properly. And so I want to reduce that, consolidate to some extent, and get to the point where, you know, I can wear them all in decent rotation.
Give equal wrist time to each of them. Yeah.
Right. The love that got me into it in the first place, you know, at this point, it's good and it's fun. There's been reasons why I've collected what I've collected. And even the ones that I'll get rid of. I mean, I enjoyed them. There's a reason I bought them, but it's time for somebody else to enjoy them.
Awesome.
Another point that we wanted to discuss with you is now that you've been through the number of pieces that you got in the collection, is what is your favorite piece and why is it your favorite piece?
They're going to be disappointed. I'm going to walk around that one a little bit. You know, that's a little bit like asking who your favorite child is. You can't really answer that. I mean, certainly there are pieces that I find myself reaching for more often. As I alluded to in the beginning, I mean, my first watch was a manual wound Hamilton. I really still appreciate, you know, that older technology. There's something about winding a watch every morning that's truly satisfying. So, you know, there's a number of watches that I've reached for a lot. There's a number of watches that have really great stories behind them. So, you know, we could talk about that a little bit. And then of course there's brands, obviously. We alluded to these sub collections that have occurred. And, you know, that's because I really, you know, have a tie to the brand in some way, shape or form. So, I mean, an example of one of the watches, you know, I'd say probably one of the jewels of the collection is my RGM 801. You know, and it's funny, we talk about movements a lot and we could get into that later, but generally I don't buy a watch solely based on its movement. This would be a rare exception though. The 801 is, you know, the first mechanical American watch movement since Hamilton abandoned building movements itself in 1969. So, you know, that came out by RGM, Roland G. Murphy, a number of years ago now. But that's a truly beautiful watch. It's a mechanical marvel. You know, so that's certainly up there. My wife, my Submariner is certainly also one of my favorite watches for a number of reasons. I've always really loved the watch. I mean, the Submariner's iconic, and I think that dive watches are a category of watches that I've gotten very heavily into. I think there's a number of reasons that we have a tendency to look to dive watches, whether it's that image of toughness or being able to go places we probably won't go. You know, I have dive watches that I physically would implode before the watch would. So, you know, the Submariner is one of those, and it has a great story. I mean, I had a Pepsi GMT Master and I'd sold it. Actually, it helped fund the RGM 801. But one day my wife and I were driving around and she looks at me and she says, if you could have a Rolex for $1,000, would you do it? Well, of course the answer is yes, right? So it turns out she had put a 14060 on layaway and had been slowly paying it down. And, you know, that was great. Obviously, you know, being for my wife, being a minimal investment from my perspective, at least personally. And, you know, replacing a Rolex had been gone for a while and getting a Rolex that I always wanted. And also at the time, the Maxi case was coming out. And there was a lot of question whether or not Rolex even was going to do another standard Submariner, that they potentially would just go with the Submariner date going forward. So there was, you know, that speculation in the market that the Submariner might be finished. But either way, even if it had been the Maxi, I'd rather have the older one because it just has that closest tie to the early Submariners from the 60s, the old 4-digit references, as opposed to you know, the future 5 digits, which obviously have the DNA, but there's a substantial difference in the way they look and feel.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a good one too. And you know, anything that you can tie a story to like that too, it's like, how many other watch enthusiasts or watch guys out there, you know, dream that their wife is gonna say, hey baby, How would you like?
Stop spending in watches. We need to invest in the baby.
Right, exactly.
How would you like a Rolex for $1,000? Because I've pretty much paid this one off for you. So that's awesome. And obviously,
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, there's micros too, though. I don't want to, it's not just those big dollar boutique or or big brands like Rolex. There's certainly plenty of micros that I love and reach for quite a bit. Some examples of those, might be a Resco. I've got a number of Rescos I really love, and there's that military connection that I like with them. There's certainly a number of hand wounds. The Stella Felix is beautiful. As much as you might not want to hear, you may or may not want to hear it, the Mint Defender actually is as well. I mean, the degree to which the watch is adaptable really lends itself to being, it's certainly a diver, but in many ways all purpose. I think, Mike and I were even talking about it at one point, if you wanted to have one travel watch, the Mint could certainly be it. Take one of the smooth polished bezels for dinner, take a 12-hour for when you have to track, time zone back home, if you have to give somebody a call. I mean, the adaptability of the watch, and also it's probably not going to cause any sort of an altercation while traveling either. So
if somebody wants to cut your hand off, it's like, I guess just take the watch. Awesome. So I guess just kind of keeping things moving along, and it's interesting kind of as a segue into that, when you talk about dive watches and how many of us connect with dive watches, like my collection's dive watch heavy. I mean, I know an awful lot of people whose collections might be a little dive watch heavy or exclusive.
We all want to be James Bond, Mike.
Absolutely.
I guess that's where the thing comes from, It's like a tool watch, it's a cool accessories, and Sean Connery was wearing it, so why not? Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I guess from there, and it's funny because we're both active in a lot of the micro brand groups and stuff like that, and we see a lot of divers come and go, and we see a lot of divers. There's a certain audience that says, "Please don't show me another dive watch," but ultimately, we know that people want another dive watch. I like you said, the fact that Alex, when he designed the Mint watch initially, that we're able to bring a dive watch that could be a dress watch, could be, kind of a
kid watch or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's a good gala, right? Like, could go anywhere, do anything kind of piece. But from your perspective, having spent the time that you have in the watch community as a whole, and as a collector and enthusiast as a whole, and within the micro brand side of things too. So what do you think is missing from the watch industry now, whether that be on the micro or the macro side of things? And what do you think that, from your perspective, you'd like to see more of?
Well, I think that had you asked me that question 10, 15 years ago, before micro brands really took off in any sort of en masse, there was a degree of creativity that was missing from the market. The large brands have their traditions and their heritages, whether or not they're entirely true. They have a story to tell, and they keep telling that story. And so, that's not to say that there's not ever anything innovative, but there is a design criteria to follow, I guess. And what the micro brands have done is rather to really think outside the box from that perspective, right? To go back to Mint for a second, I don't know if I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's certainly not the first watch that had a removable bezel. There was the Fossil Defender, ironically enough, actually. And that had a removable bezel. And you could change the look of the watch. There was a re-edition they did that came with 3 bezels, but those bezels aren't functional. You put them on, it changes the look of the watch, but you can't actually use the bezel to time anything anymore.
Okay.
And that's, you know, that's fine from a fashion perspective, I suppose, but it's antithetical to what the watch is supposed to do, right? Mike and I have talked about this before too, and I don't dive deep enough to have to worry about a dive watch, but I do actually use the timing bezel to time, you know, things. So so having that functionality removed is not beneficial. So you know, there's that. Originally, a lot of micros were relatively inexpensive. There were some that were a little bit more moderately priced or even somewhat expensive. Early micros like Madison Watch Company, Mark II, right? Bill moved from modding Seikos to starting his own company. That's grown to the point where it's put a fair amount of pressure on the established brands, and really, you know, the lower to mid market has been eaten up quite a bit by that, right? It's you have micros that are in the you know, easily up to $1,000, $1,500, even $2,000, and that eats into some of the entry level luxury macro brands like Tissot, for example, Mito, brands like that. And so it's very interesting how that competition has really changed things, I think, for the watch industry in general. What's missing? I mean, we talked about this a little earlier. There's a lot that's certainly not missing. We certainly don't need more middlemen. We don't need more distributors. What I'd like to see more of, I mean, I'd like to see the micro brand just keep creating, keep being different, keep thinking outside of the box and finding, you know, either new solutions to problems or problems that we haven't found solutions to yet.
Awesome.
Do you think that the micro brand market will need to be more accessible offline instead of being just sold online? Would you like to see more of micro brand product within the retail stores or retail space, if I may say?
There's certainly some benefit to that, but there's also a lot of overhead that goes on with you know, having your watch in a authorized dealer or a boutique.
Price goes up. Yeah.
And of course, you know, there's the luxury ADs, but you know, you don't see as many of those little watch shops as you used to if you go to the mall. You know, that used to be extremely common, and it's not as common as it used to be for a number of reasons, or even worse, the little service shops that used to be in the mall that you could stop by, get your battery changed, maybe do some minor mechanical work to your watch. That's becoming increasingly rare, much like the camera store is, you know, pretty much extinct at this point. But also, this is actually something that years ago we had the opportunity. One of the watch forums I was in some time ago, we had the opportunity to meet with Roland G. Murphy from RGM and chat with him a little bit about you know, what was up and coming, see his watches in person, and we asked him if he would ever sell his watches in a you know, an authorized dealer or something along those lines, and he talked about that a little bit, and he had said that he had tried it. And one of the problems with that is, you know, once again, you're running up against the big companies, and the big companies are incentivizing salespeople to move their product. And so when you have a small organization, whether it's something like RGM or Resco or Mint, where, you know, your entire staff is
we don't have this kind of margin, for sure. We don't have as much margin as a big player to be able to retribute the sales guy. Yeah, definitely.
You don't.
That's a block. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have the margin. You don't have usually the existing inventory or the cold inventory to move. And you're going to run into the problem where you can't incentivize the salespeople to move your product. So those few pieces you can spare to put into the store are going to sit in the corner and unless somebody happens to make it that far back and take a look at it and ask to see it, then it's not gonna. And the other problem is, I mean, maybe if you're what we might consider to be one of the higher priced micros, like maybe a Manta or something like that.
Yeah,
That could certainly, I think they may even be in in a shop in St. Louis locally to them. But beyond that, it's going to be very difficult, right? I mean, you consider the amount of product you're building versus a large brand, and the margin, and it's just, it would be nice. Is it really feasible for the business model? Probably not.
Yeah, and that's just it, right? It's like, could we see mint in a retail shop? For sure, locally, where there's that local connection already, right? Like you would say, like Monta potentially could be in St. Louis too. And the other thing, like you said, if people, if you're not taking a chunk of margin to incentivize a salesperson, and you don't have that front of store presence, the person that's going to go to back of store, back of display cabinet to find you, chances are they knew you were where you are because they found you through the channels that microbrands are conventionally selling through right now, online, Facebook groups, Instagram, that kind of stuff. That's why they, dug their way through the sea of divers to the back of the watch shop to find it, right? So
exactly.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome.
Which price category do you feel the more value in watches? Does the price makes the piece? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's both analytical and emotional, right? Analytically speaking, much like a sports car, right? Performance to some extent over a certain point, and we could think of performance also by way of complication for watches. At some point, it's gonna go up exponentially for a marginal increase, right? So I guess the point being, a lot of, if you need something very specific, and this obviously was important in the 60s and 70s, the days of going back to the 50s as well, and even before that, the days of exploration, where you may need something like, by way of where we were with lubrication and watchmaking technology at the time, something like an Explorer or a Smiths to climb the Everest, or a Submariner or Seamaster, and we could go on with respect to dive watches, certainly. And I guess if I'm going to mention those two, I should at least mention Blancpain as well. But those days of exploration, you needed that technology or those advances from a watchmaking perspective. Obviously now you could grab a Sunto or even a Timex probably and climb the mountain without any problem. I mean, from the perspective of, obviously, if we get into quartz, then we probably at least want something thermocompensated. But the argument is, obviously from a perspective of where manufacturing is and where technology is, almost any watch is fine for climbing the mountain. Plenty of watches are going to go at least as deep as you're going to go without any problem. So that technology perspective maybe isn't as important. If there was some weird complication you needed, then you may have a limitation, from the pool of options to buy for a watch, and that may drive you higher cost. I think what you're getting at is, let's say we just need a three-hand, watch of some perspective. And I think that, there's value in any price tier you can think of, whether it's a few hundred to 500, 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to a couple or a few thousand. There's certainly some great values in any of those categories. I think that, if you look at entry luxury and more the higher end of micros, I think there you can find a ton of luxury, or excuse me, a ton of value. But even, regardless of what your budget, there are pieces that offer great value. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, Alex, but
No, but it's a hard question because actually, the price doesn't make the value, and that doesn't make the quality of the piece. Which
yeah, and there's from an emotional perspective, there's so much that might go into your watch choice. Obviously, your budget matters. Your budget always matters. And what you perceive to drive value in a watch matters. I mean, whether that's, and we could get into the whole movement discussion. That's an entire sidebar. But for some people, the movement, the movement is important, and I'm certainly wouldn't say it shouldn't, or won't say it isn't to some extent. But when we're talking about one movement versus another, well, then you might
whether you're taking a Rolex, you're taking a Tudor, or whatever it is. Guess what? It's still a 3-hand watch with a date complication. That's it. So right. You know what I mean? So yes, I understand this one is in-house. So of course there is a bit maybe more craftsmanship in the execution, which pump up the price. But at the end of the day, my friend, it's an analog 3-hand watch. You know what I mean? You're not a GPA4, and you're not like in high complication Patek or World Timer or whatever it is. So,
absolutely. From a movement perspective, but then also, I guess we could be even more general, right? And say quartz versus mechanical, and mechanical, whether it's automatic or hand wound, and where you see value there. I mean, you could, especially if we're below a certain price range, you can easily argue that quartz is going to be far more accurate than,
of course,
than the mechanical,
indeed,
watches you're looking at. For me, I love hand wound watches. There's just something about that connection of winding it every day. That's the least advanced of the three major categories. But there's also other things, right? The theoretical purpose of the watch, other than telling time, whether it's a diver, an aviator, etc., a chronograph versus a 3-hand, or if we keep it to basic complications, a chrono or a GMT, or just a 3-hand, date.
And that's it. And I think that ties back into being a genuine watch guy and genuine lover of watches is, and no offense to anybody out in the community or anything like that, but I think there is a lot of people that they can easily make that determination of what they perceive as a $300, $500, $700, $1,000, $1,500 watch, right? Without really thinking of what is that emotional connection to it, right? How much value do you place on a movement? Because realistically, like Alex said, I mean, a 3-hand watch is a 3-hand watch is a 3-hand watch to a lot of people, but then you place that value between in that mechanical connection, that person, the kind of machine connection with a hand wind watch, right? So it's cool. That's kind of an unexpected answer, right? But it just shows that that term value can mean so many different things to different people.
Certainly, a lot goes in to levels of finish from a perspective of either competent machining or manual labor, and with some exceptions, you to get a nicely, a very nicely finished watch that will cost money for the obvious reason that they're, especially if it's hand done, there's a lot of hours that go into that. There are watches that are relatively inexpensive that have excellent finishing. Not to plug Mint again, but for a watch that, I can't help it. Okay. If you're talking about a watch that, if we look at the most basic kit, right, it doesn't have a lot of the components to change. For a watch that costs $350-ish retail, it's very nicely finished. And there's others out there like it. I think I mentioned the Stella Felix earlier. I mean, for its price range, it's very nicely finished, and we could go on. We could go up and down the scale. There are certainly standouts within certain price categories. So if finish is your thing, there are specific brands or models that certainly stick out. So I guess that just drives back to, depending on what you're looking for, that's going to drive where you're going to see your value.
Right. For me, finish is a big deal. I'm not in the price category that I collect in, it's like, I'm not getting into any gross complications and movements or anything like that. And then the movement itself, like, I don't place a high value on a high dollar movement, but I place a high value on high level finishing, because I enjoy looking at the finishing of my watch. I enjoy looking at the design of my watch, and I like looking at the side profile of the case. It's kind of, it's kind of funny for me personally. It's like, every single website's got, a watch dial up, and I'm like skipping through the pictures, like, hey, show me that case side. I gotta see that case side. What's it gonna look like? So it is, yeah, it's funny from that perspective too, right? Do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big question would be the story about what drove you to obviously there's an interest amongst all of us from a watch enthusiasm perspective, but what drove you to take your idea, and see that through to fruition?
Okay, so it's great that you gave us that opportunity, because it's not something that I've been openly talking about, because the back end story is not something very happy, but so you give me a chance, so it's maybe good to talk about it. So basically, my first watch was also something mechanical. It was a watch that my dad offered me. My dad used to do all his university in Japan, because he was a judo player. He was a former Marine Commando, and he was a judo champion. So he was training in Japan for the French team at the Kodokan, and he was studying at Meiji University. While he was there, it was the 70s, and that's where the old Seiko diver thing, affordable Seiko diver thing started. So that being said, I've been into watch through the mechanical things, and I left Europe to go live in Asia to make a living, because there were just more opportunities in my business field. And unfortunately, I lost my dad, and I was abroad, and I didn't have the chance to actually be with him, let's say, in the last moments. But I inherited these watches. So some of them, part of them were the Seiko watches. And as you mentioned earlier, when you're young, you're more in the work, you don't really like that work-life balance. So me, I was like, with I would say the sadness or the pain, I kind of like dig myself into work and push myself into a burnout. Okay, and while having the burnout, I did a therapy, and the first thing that the counselor told me is like, you need to go back to hobbies. And I had those watch from my dad. And one day I was like doing some research for, I used to do a lot of freelance design. And I realized that, you actually can turn a standard Seiko watch into something else, just being able to source parts.
Right.
And besides the value, the sentimental value that those SKX that I had from my dad, there was nothing that will visually differentiate them. So I started going to modding. So I was already in Hong Kong, so I bought some parts from Jake Dagaz and from Harold. And I did this for a couple of years, and I really enjoyed the hobby, because it was something that was also helped me to refocus on myself. You know what I mean? Like spend time for myself, not thinking about anything. And I like the symbolic of like when you're doing this watch assembly thing, you're tinkering a watch, you're tinkering a time tool. So it was like a symbolic for me taking control over my life. And I found this approach really interesting, and it was also calming me down and helping me with any kind of stress, like stress release strategy, I would say. And I was shocked that actually no watch brand trying to address this. All brands, they want to sell you, for example, Rolex. I sell you the Submariner. You see, there is this amazing green bezel. And then the next year, I sell you the new Submariner. It's exactly the same thing, but now the bezel is blue. And then, so you like all those brands, they're using marketing artifice, like to create a new demand. And I was like, why not making a brand where you will release watch, and then regularly you release accessories, and people, instead of trying to resell them another watch that they might not need, you're just providing them with accessories option. And with something cool, like it's a bit like a do-it-yourself, something that you can do on your own. And you create that interaction with the product. So that was mainly what pushed me to actually raise capitals, find suppliers, design my first watch prototype, and then try to go into business.
Yeah, thank you for your father's service, and sorry to
I appreciate it, man. No, that's life, you know. It's like everybody has to die one day, you know. It's part of life, man.
That's part of that evolving relationship with time, right? It's like, you know, that realization of mortality. And I think it's when, you know, you lose a grandparent or a parent or something like that, you know, it shifts something in your adult life, right? It shifts it to a different gear or a different level of understanding. So nice.
Mike, where the audience can actually connect with you?
Probably the easiest way to get in touch with me is via my Instagram account for my watch collection, and that's at The Smoking Watch.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you very, very much for the time. We certainly do appreciate, you know, you sharing your perspective with us, and I know you and I talk on a regular basis, but you know, it's great to get you to, you know, in front of, I guess, virtually in front of, which is too commonplace these days, Alex. Yeah, thanks a lot. Alex, do you have anything to say?
No, thank you again so much, Mike. First of all, thanks for supporting our project. Very touched. You're and thanks again for participating to the podcast. It's really good to have a individual like you in the watch community. It really makes a difference. It's awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks a ton for having me on. It was great.